A few people got in touch after my last video to ask how I feel about the level of realism in the Inibuilds 350. It's probably quite apparent from the videos that clearly I'm quite new to the world of flight simulator. So I'm initially blown away by the level of realism, the level of detail in the textures, how everything looks. Perhaps may have clouded my judgment somewhat to the point where I will have overlooked some of the inaccuracies. And it's clear that you guys expect a higher standard, and rightly so, given the price of this software. In today's video, the plan is to talk you through some of the things that I think they got right. And also, I'm going to point out one or two inaccuracies in the FMS. Then I'm going to take you on a few laps of the circuit at Heathrow, just for a sort of a simulated base training, just to see how it feels to hand fly. Now, there are lots of toys on this desk, but this is my input device, joystick, if you will. It's not a flashy sim rig, so please excuse the quality of my flying. And if you are going to join me on this journey down the rabbit hole that is modern flight simulators, I would appreciate some suggestions on where to go to start upgrading certainly the way I hand fly these aeroplanes. Also, please note, this video was recorded before a very helpful commenter pointed out that I could just use the mouse scroll to change things like the heading and the track bugs on the FCU, rather than dragging it across the screen like a Neanderthal. Look, I want to start by giving credit to Inibuilds for what they have created, because it's undeniable that it is a beautiful product. They've put many thousands of hours into faithfully replicating the aircraft, multiple liveries, the ECAM, the cabins, all very, very accurate and very, very nice. So let's get into a couple of things that, in my opinion, could still use some work. Here I'm inputting the usual data into the FMS fuel and load page. The first calculation says it's going to take us -4 hours and -24 minutes to arrive in Dubai, and in the process somehow create 17.5 tons of fuel. Then it has a little think and eventually decides that if we start with 65 tons and burn 35, then we have an extra 116 tons, as flying to our alternate will again miraculously produce 89.5 tons. Despite this, the calculations for destination and alternate at the bottom of the page are actually correct, but it's using the wrong data. It's actually making this calculation using the current fuel on board. At this stage of the cockpit preparation, all calculations on this page should be made using the block fuel that the crew have entered. And finally, once we've loaded all of the fuel that the FMS thinks that we should have on board, the bottom of the FMS tells us that we have an extra 21 tons, or just over 4 hours, and simultaneously the ECAM is displaying a memo telling us we currently don't have enough fuel to fly to destination. Let's talk about audio for a second. I've seen across multiple forums that people seem to be unhappy with the level of fan noise in the flight deck prior to engine start. I can confirm that it's entirely possible to have a normal conversation without the need for noise-cancelling headphones before we start the engine. Now, selecting the noise-cancelling headphones function does bring us a little bit closer to reality. But if I'm wearing noise-cancelling headphones, how then can I suddenly hear the PA? Alright, enough whining from me, let's go fly some circuits and see how this thing handles. Oh, and speaking of whining, now this one I really do struggle with, because for many people the coolest part of getting to experience these jets through the world of flight simulation is when you line up on the runway and apply takeoff power. So you've really got to get this part right. It sounds to me like they've taken the normal engine spool up sound and then somebody has accidentally overlaid a second sound on top of it that comes in and disappears again. This is what it sounds like for real. that second sound doesn't exist. Whether you're selecting toga thrust, flex thrust, it's not there. So now we're airborne, and I'm deliberately manhandling the aeroplane to get a feel for it, and I'll be honest, I'm impressed. The way it turns, the way it climbs, the pitch, all feels really quite realistic. Once again, however, the FMA are doing something I can't really explain. It seems to be that when I pitch up and the aircraft loses energy, I get an amber box flashing on the vertical mode where the flight directors and therefore the autopilot vertical engagement mode should be. Except that the flight directors are switched off, so there shouldn't be anything there. If it's maybe trying to simulate alpha floor mode, firstly it's coming on too early, and second, it's in the wrong box. Alpha floor is an auto thrust mode, so the word speed in the top left hand corner should be replaced by a.floor, meaning alpha floor, with a flashing amber box around it. That's the only thing I can think it's perhaps trying to do, but I have never seen a blank amber flashing box on an FMA that shouldn't be there at all because the flight directors are switched off. Okay, so let me just talk you through a brief touch and go maneuver. So at this stage, all the flight directors are off. I'm just looking out of the window to align myself with the center line and the aiming point. I see 2 reds, 2 whites on the PAPI lights on the left-hand side of the runway. Please note that they don't appear to align with the glide path. So if I followed that glide path, I would be landing short of the aiming point. So you'll see when following an ideal 3-degree slope, we appear to be just above the glide path as indicated on the PFD.
30, 20, 10, 5.
After we've touched down, I'm going to spool up the engines about halfway, allow them to stabilize, go through to toga. Once we reach the V approach, then it's safe to rotate. Note that I'm doing these circuits in config 3, which is a valid landing and takeoff configuration. Once we're airborne, raise the landing gear, activate the approach phase so that it doesn't accelerate towards 250 knots, and turn the flight directors off again, and back into the visual circuit. Okay, so here's attempt number 2 then, starting from a nice stabilized approach, and if we have a ground speed of just under 140 knots, we'll be looking for a rate of descent of around 700 feet per minute to maintain your 3-degree glide. A quick note on landing technique. The techniques manual suggests that we should close the thrust levers around 40 feet and start your flare maneuver at or around 40 feet depending on your rate of descent and other factors like runway slope, tailwind, elevation, etc. But around 40 feet seems to work. As you do approach the ground, you should be changing your gaze from looking at the aiming points to looking towards the end of the runway. This brings in your peripheral vision and gives you a better judgment of the rate of descent as you get closer to the ground. After main gear touchdown, gently lower the nose onto the center line, and you would normally start your planning your braking to vacate the runway where you plan to if you're not using the VTV. Okay, so let's try one more then with the autopilot engaged to see how well tuned the Autoland function is on the Inibuilds A350. Note the FMA modes. Glide slope mode and lock means it's tracking the glide slope and the localizer. Around 400 feet, but no later than 350 feet, that will change to land, meaning capable of performing an autoland. As we said earlier, the glide slope and the PAPIs don't appear to be entirely coincident. So as the aeroplane is following the glide slope, though not particularly accurately, as you can see now we have 4 reds on the PAPIs, meaning the aircraft is below where it should be. Also appears to be sitting slightly right of centerline. What rollout mode means is that in zero visibility, in particularly foggy conditions, after landing, the aircraft will continue to track the centerline. You'll note that autopilot 1 and 2 are still engaged in rollout mode, meaning until I disconnect the autopilot, it should continue to track the centerline. However, with no input from me. I'm not touching the side stick whatsoever. It appears to spear off to the left side in the grass. Still in roll-out mode, still with autopilot 1 and 2 engaged. I think that maybe just sums up some of the things that we've been discussing. Beautiful product. Still some work to go on the realism.